Good morning, everyone in the United States, and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us from Europe. Thank you so much for joining us for this report launch, co-hosted by the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Europe Center and the Transform Europe Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, and I am thrilled to be able to moderate this event today. We are here to launch a new report, Escaping the Permanent Suez, Navigating the Geopolitics of European Decarbonization, and it's co-authored by our three brilliant panelists, along with extensive research support from Francis Shin at the Atlantic Council as well. Ben Judah, Director of the Transform Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council, is here with us. Tim Sahai, non-resident senior fellow with the Transform Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council, as well as the co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. We also have Shaheen Valeh, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and Technology at the German Council on Foreign Relations. So the way that this event is going to go, for the first 40 minutes or so, our report authors are going to present the research report to us, talk about its findings, and then we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so taking questions from the audience and having an interactive, moderated conversation. So for those that are tuning in, you can use the website askac.org during the event while you're listening to the report authors. Submit your questions, and then I'll use those questions at the end of this event during the discussion period. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This is an extremely topical report. All of these issues that have been discussed here are in the news. They're at the top of everyone's mind. So with that, thank you for joining us. And I'll go ahead and pass the floor to Ben Judah to get us started. Ben, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for such a kind introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, this morning in the United States and this afternoon in Europe. When we began thinking together about what would become this report over a year ago, we felt as the authors that there were really three debates and three questions that needed to be urgently brought together into one piece of work in order to make sense of Europe's strategic position in the geopolitics of decarbonisation and in order to develop a route map for how Europe could succeed in this emerging new global context and order. That first question we were thinking about together was, is what has just happened, in as far as Europe's energy shock from the war in Ukraine, is it a unique occurrence, or is it actually part of a long-term historical pattern that Europe has been in really for many decades and really throughout this current energy age, the age of oil and gas? That was the first question we began addressing. The second question we began really thinking about together is, what is the emerging green world order, which, obscured at first by the pandemic and certainly for us Europeans by the war in Ukraine, has been emerging over the last few years? What can we identify as the central planks, the central competitions, and the central contests of that? And then the third question is looking at Europe, and by that we mean in this conversation the European Union. What needs to be done internally inside the European Union in order to make the continent's kind of main geopolitical expression a viable player in this emerging new global context? So we began kind of thinking together to tie all of those together, and the research began really looking at Europe's history, and that's where we really came to the conclusion that it is a strategic mistake to look at what happened in 2022 when Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine and responded through a series of energy sanctions on Europe and really an energy war against the European Union. It's a mistake to think of that as a one-off. In fact, that is a historical repeat of a situation that Europe has been in since the Suez Crisis of 1956. And that situation is what we call the Permanent Suez. So what is the Permanent Suez? We argue that there's a certain energy certain reluctance to think about energy really as the kind of motor of modernity, the core of modernity, and really the kind of defining factor as to whether or not a kind of great power sort of thrives, succeeds, or declines. And if we want to understand European power really in the 19th century, it's really important to remember that Britain and France and first Prussia and then the United Germany really had abundant, astonishing supplies of coal, which was the motor of that form of modernity. It's been said that Britain was the Saudi Arabia of coal, which would make France the UAE of coal. So you see Western Europe really in a position where it has abundant, cheap energy. And Europe's first strategic predicament is clearly visible to strategists such as kind of Winston Churchill in the early part of the 20th century. Is Europe is moving into an age of hydrocarbons and it certainly looked that way at the time to these players. There was a real lack of them. Europe did not have that abundance of oil and gas, which was located and would come to be revealed to be located in astonishing numbers as the century went on, primarily outside Europe, in the United States, in the Gulf, and in Russia. Of course, there are oil deposits in Europe, but none really of the scale of Europe's coal deposits that really were the motors of empire in the 19th century. So Europe finds itself coming into the sort of post-World War II age in the 1950s, facing an intense strategic dilemma, which we argue it has never escaped. And that is, it is dependent on its energy for most of its energy on outside players, many of them which are authoritarian states, which have consolidated thanks to the revenues of hydrocarbons. And that has put Europe in a position of economic vulnerability and of political weakness, really going forward from that point. And the reason that the Suez Crisis is so important is not only that it reveals that Britain and France can no longer play the role of independent expeditionary military powers in the Middle East, but that it brutally reveals that Europe no longer has the ability to externally control the choke points and the deposits of oil and gas in the Middle East, which is going to in part drive its modernization and prosperity in the 20th century. We then identify in the report that the Permanent Suez has struck twice. It strikes in 1973 with the Arab-led oil embargo, which sees Europe's energy vulnerability exploited following the Yom Kippur War by a Saudi-led initiative to economically punish European countries for their support of the State of Israel. And then we see in 2022, Vladimir Putin really picking up that playbook to apply it again. So in the report, we talk about the many strategies that different European countries pursued to try and escape the Permanent Suez, and how all of those really have not succeeded. Germany, after 1973, doubling down on Russia. Britain doubling down on certain relationships in the Middle East. Italy doubling down on relationships in the Middle East or or North Africa. None of these have really been able to take Europe away from this fundamental predicament. So why are we writing this report now? We're writing this report now because the Permanent Suez has struck again at a moment of profound change, both technological and climatic. And the project that we embarked on is to try and ask and answer the question of, can Europe, through decarbonisation, escape that Permanent Suez? Can Europe, through a green industrial revolution and through net zero, bring back that energy independence and that access to cheap energy, which has kind of dogged it as a strategic player for many decades. So I'm going to pass on to Tim now, and Tim really led in the report on answering a lot of the questions about what world are we in now, because we can't begin to answer that question of, can Europe escape the permanent Suez without looking at what the green world order actually is made of in terms of competing industrial policies, critical minerals, and of course the sinews of finance. So Tim, thank you so much for all the work you've kind of done on this report. And it's been a real pleasure working with you on this over the last year. And please kind of take it away.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, the Permanent Suez report has been a year and a half in the making, and it's really been amazing to work with Ben and Shaheen together. So I'll just sort of sketch out the chapter on the green world order, and we can already sort of see its contours emerging in this era of great power competition. There's competitive green industrial policy. There's a clash of global mining webs, and then the big financial challenge of sustaining decades of high investment in both rich countries and less developed countries. So in short, the green world order is about the order and the hierarchical order in our world economy of machines, metals, and money. So first the machines. So decarbonization just requires industrial policy. It's now abundantly clear that this transition will be shaped by competition in great power industrial policy, not collaboration. In fact, 3 competing regimes of industrial policy have been announced in the last 3 years, beginning with China, as Xi announced his carbon neutrality pledge in 2020, followed by the US with Biden's IRA in 2022, and then the EU with its 2023 Green Deal industrial plan and the Net Zero Industrial Act, which was itself followed by a quite ambitious earlier a European Green Deal in 2019. Each of these come with questions about the resolve, about the policies and the funding behind these pledges. And we discuss the consulting and the size changing the chemical basis of the economy from fossil fuels to metals. And that makes it inherently a mining process. This means, second, the geopolitics will be defined by mining and coal, oil, and gas, but we will be using a lot more metals. And when it comes to geopolitics, mines are best understood not just as a hole in the ground, but as webs of influence and interests. And we're already seeing sort of 2 or 3 rival global mining webs centered around the US, Europe, and China. Many of these are in wealthy allied countries like Australia and Canada that already have special ties to the US. Australia alone extracts more than half of the world's lithium, but the rest are not such allied states. And the clean energy race will, in fact, reshape relations between advanced and less developed countries. And we make it a point in this report to not forget the agency of these countries. Think of Indonesia, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, DRCs. They are experimenting with new forms of mineral developmentalism. They're seeking to contest wealthy countries' place in the value chain in terms of refining and assembly. And when it comes to the great powers, the EU and the United States have also discussed the idea of making critical raw materials club that would provide producers of metals with enough assurances of demand so that they can then invest in mining capacity, and also means to manage prices. We have seen very sharp volatility in lithium prices that shot up 3 or 4x in the last couple of years and have come back down again. But these economic arguments should not hide the fact that such a club would create a profound geopolitical fault line with potentially irreversible consequences, especially if China feels that its own access to such materials is at risk. The EU and the US trail China in securing resources and processing capacity. China is already the leading global mining network with dominance in both the extraction of metals and a commanding position in the value-added refining step. So these advantages will prove hard for the EU and the US to challenge. And if trade restrictions, tariffs, and embargoes on Chinese metals are used and they provoke Chinese retaliations, that would delay the clean energy transition. So as a result, both the EU and the US are sort of scrambling to secure their own critical mineral networks to ensure that they too have the metals required for this transition. And the critical question that we sort of ask and analyze the trade-offs of is whether the EU and the US join hands, or do they go it alone? Lastly, we come to the money question. It's clear that advanced economies can decarbonize alone, but that's not going to actually lead to overall planetary climate stability and hence security. Debt, decarbonization, and development are all intrinsically linked. And the big gap that we identify is that the funding mechanism for this, in especially the least developed countries, are not in place. This means that this new emerging green world order is dependent on this critical fault line. Who's got the access to capital and finance? And that's going to require changing the global financial architecture to help poorer countries make these investments at the scale necessary and within the time that is necessary. Meanwhile, there's a lot of financial distress in the least developed countries. UNCTAD estimates that the external debt stocks in the low and middle income countries are now over $11 trillion. And because they rely on short-term loans denominated in foreign currencies, dollars and euros, indebted countries have been subjected to very high debt servicing costs. And that basically means that governments are not going to use their scarce hard currency to actually pay back their loans. They're going to use that to pay back their loans and not make the climate investments that are necessary at scale. And we essentially sort of think and provide some recommendations about how the global financial architecture can be changed. So in sum, it's clear that the geopolitics of decarbonization will sort of play out on these questions. Can those critical raw materials be freely accessed? Who will actually be added, and the jobs and the industrial know-how over the course of this transition? Can this enormous transition funding gap actually be bridged? Will there be compensation of developing countries that have not emitted emissions, and how is that going to happen? On what terms will debt restructuring happen, so that you actually get enough money flowing into clean energy and thereby providing planetary stability to everyone? And the main question, to what extent will the middle powers in the less developed countries coalesce around the US, Europe, or China? Now, all of this is a pretty daunting sort of geopolitical project of decarbonization, but the EU has, at least since 2020, demonstrated that it can act decisively when it comes to collective debt and pandemic relief, when it comes to the Russia sanctions, energy decoupling, and military aid. It's also putting forward, in the last year, its own project to set the rules of global trade in this clean world order, the CBAM tariffs, whose effectiveness, we still don't know in practice, despite CBAM being opposed by the US and by other middle powers. Brussels is attempting a serious effort to make the continent a pole in the green world order and managing these dilemmas posed by competing green industrial policy, the dilemmas posed by minerals, and trying to fix this global financial architecture. So fundamentally, the Green World Order, we argue, is still up for grabs. I'll leave it to Shaheen to take up the critical question of Europe's own political challenges.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ben. It's been also a pleasure to work on this report over the last few months. And a lot of things that we've been working on have been kind of moving as we were writing, and as you'll see, some of the things that I'll describe about Europe are moving as we speak. Essentially, I think our conclusion about the ways and means for Europe to address this permanent Suez crisis and to try to address it, are held back by what we view as sort of fundamental challenges that Europe needs to overcome. And these fundamental challenges are holding back Europe in sort of three dimensions. One is, sort of the fiscal dimension. The other is the regulatory dimension, which we view as equally important. And we've identified, five big challenges. One is the fiscal problem, and I'll describe it in more detail, both at the European and at the national level. The second is the hostage problem, and the fact that Europe is neither a true federation nor a unitary state, and therefore is faced with a number of challenges when it comes to decision making for such strategic decision as energy policy. The third is the collective action problem, which is also due to Europe's peculiar structure and it's subject to intense lobbying by interest groups. The fourth is the just transition problem, and this is one of the things that I was mentioning earlier that is moving as we speak. Europe at the moment is being sort of blocked in Germany and France, to some extent in Belgium, by strikes and demonstrations by agricultural workers who are complaining about the cost of the energy and climate transition for agriculture. So I think the social dimension of the climate and energy transition is something that is fundamental for Europe and one that is holding Europe back in some ways. And the last, but also a critical element of Europe's challenge is the industrial policy problem, what we've called sort of the Concorde problem, in reference to this great Franco-British experience of building a supersonic passenger aircraft, which was kind of hailed as the great success of industrial policy in the 70s and 80s, and came down crashing, both in spirit, but also literally. And so I'll go over these sort of five problems in turn, and how Europe can address them. The first is the fiscal problem, which comes in two dimensions. One is the limited fiscal space at the national level in many member states, and the limited fiscal space that is made even more limited by quite outdated European fiscal rules that are being reformed as we speak. In fact, I'm connecting from Brussels, where I've spoken to a number of officials and parliamentarians who are sort of putting the final touches on a set of reforms of the European Stability and Growth Pact. But my assessment is that none of these reforms at the moment really provide European member states with the sort of national fiscal space they need to invest in their energy and climate transition. The second, and maybe the more important one, is the collective EU debt, collective EU budget problem. As you will remember, in 2020, the EU assembled a large borrowing of 750 billion euros to finance its response to the COVID crisis. And in effect, what we would need today is to assemble a similar amount of borrowing or a similar increase in the EU budget to finance Europe's climate and energy transition. And the reality as we speak is that Europe is not prepared to do that yet. We will see whether it is prepared to do it between now and 2027, when the current multi-annual financial framework, the current EU budget, which runs over a 7-year period, ends, and Europe needs to renew it. But that to us is the fundamental challenge of Europe, to basically be able to assemble the sort of financial resources that Europe needs to deliver on its promise of a green transition and of energy independence. I think the big test is what will happen between now and 2027. with, if I may say, important, and that maybe is a good segue to the collective action problem, with important elections taking place to start with in Germany in 2025 and in France in 2027. The second challenge is the collective action problem. So the fact that the European Union can be held back by individual countries that decide for a number of reasons that they don't want to take part in this transition or not as aggressively as the others. And that has been historically a big source of tension inside the EU and has undermined, I think, a more cohesive and coherent energy policy. Energy policy remains, as a matter of fact, largely a national prerogative. And one can encourage individual member states to move away from coal, to invest in renewables, to build the infrastructure that are necessary both at the national level, but also at the European level to have a more effective energy policy. But each individual member state can also be a major source of blockage. And this is what we have experienced over the years, including from countries that we would not suspect today. In 2019, we tend to forget it, but in 2019, Germany, for instance, was opposed to Europe's commitments to carbon neutrality by 2040. And it was only because a coalition of member states ended up supporting that move to carbon neutrality that Germany ended up caving. And so I think we will have a repeat of these instances. The European Commission is preparing a new package called the Horizon 2040, which basically aims to commit to reduction in CO2 emissions by 90% by 2040, and we'll see whether every member state is prepared to back this action plan. The third point is the hostage problem, and hostage to special groups and particular interest. And of course, you would imagine that the oil and the hydrocarbon lobby in Europe is particularly powerful and can lobby at several layers of government, and therefore activate the collective action problem that I've described earlier. So you've had in many places coal lobby or the oil lobby blocking action, and you now have businesses increasingly organized to flag the risks and the cost of the transition in order to delay political commitments along these commitments. What we're seeing with agricultural workers and the agribusiness sector in the Netherlands or in Germany today is a good illustration of that. Fourth, and this is related to what I've just mentioned, the just transition problem. I think there is probably a misunderstanding about how intensely redistributional these policies are. The reality is that emissions are highly related to income levels, and those who are the greatest polluters in Europe as well as in the world are the richest countries, but also the richest segments of society. And that is something that needs to be addressed if we want to have social acceptance of the energy transition and the policies that come along this transition. And last but not least, I think the real challenge we face in the economic transformation that comes with this energy transition is an industrial policy issue. As we've seen in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is probably first and foremost an industrial policy challenge. The same goes for Europe. How will Europe put together the sort of industrial policy that is required to basically move from fossil fuel to green energy or clean energy, and how will it be able to lead in the innovations that come along with the green industrial revolution? These are very difficult issues, both from an economic as well as from a policy standpoint. And these are issues that Europe has not found a great solution to. The solution we have found in the short term was essentially to undermine Europe's state aid framework to enable member states to support their domestic industry but we still lack a real pan-European vision of what a green European industrial policy looks like. And to go back to my first point, we also lack the fiscal resources to support that European industrial policy once we have it. So these are the sort of the five big challenges we've identified for Europe, and that leads us to a set of policy recommendations that are a combination of policy recommendations that are both directed to internal reforms of the EU and things that the EU can do on its own, but also that are intended to also leverage the EU's role in the world, and that echoes, I think, some of the things that Tim has mentioned earlier. So, internally, our view is that the EU should continue to commit to climate neutrality in 2040 and continue to upgrade quite considerably its climate policy to achieve these goals. The second, as you've heard, is really to do something very meaningful when it comes to fiscal, both at the national and the European level. And that means, being prepared to assemble new resources for the EU budget, to agree to a larger debt capacity for the EU budget in the period from 2027 to 2035. We believe that this needs to come along an ongoing support for Ukraine, both in its long-term reconstruction, but also to help Ukraine transition into being a greener economy. And then on the external front, there is a difficult trade-off for Europe to strike between continuing its support and its alliance with the United States on a number of fronts, in particular, potentially agreeing to join a critical raw materials club with the United States, but only to the extent that this critical raw materials club is not actively weaponized against China. Because what we think for Europe's energy transition is that benefiting and using cheap Chinese green technology will remain important. And so while Europe needs to engage with the US on a critical raw materials club, it also needs to reassure China to some extent that it's not going to cancel entirely its purchases of the necessary green technology to achieve Europe's transition. So it's a very delicate balancing act for the EU to strike between the US and China. We don't think an open confrontation and a trade conflict with China would greatly help Europe to achieve its climate transition. So we don't think it's desirable both on an economic front, but also to achieve Europe's climate and energy transition. And last but not least, and that echoes what Tim has mentioned earlier, we believe Europe can play a very meaningful role in reforming international financial institutions and playing a meaningful contribution to helping the global south, to use this expression, to achieve and accelerate its transition as well. And that to us, given the lack of interest of the United States in delivering that, we view as a critical mission for Europe. And I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Shaheen. Ben, I'll hand it back over to you just to kind of wrap it up a little bit before we get to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Shaheen, for that kind of brilliant presentation of that part of the report. It's really been a pleasure working on this with you over the last year. I just wanted to give a kind of summary, very kind of briefly, for our viewers and listeners of really the key points of this report. Our overarching argument is that in order to develop great strategy for Europe, you have to look at Europe's historical predicament, its geopolitical predicament in terms of what that means for decarbonisation, and you have to look at Europe's internal politics to work out how it can move forward in this. You have to bring these debates together, which are currently very segmented. So what we've argued here is, one, that Europe is in a long-term historical predicament in the age of hydrocarbons, which disadvantages it economically and geopolitically and leaves it vulnerable. And it has seen a repeat of severe shocks, such as in 2022 or 1973. Point two, we argue that Europe can move to mitigate and escape some of these conditions, but it's going to be very hard, and Europe's place in an emerging green world order is not assured. We've tried to map the green world order, and we've identified a couple of key factors. Number one, it's defined by competitive industrial policy from the great powers. Number two, it's defined by competing mineral webs, as decarbonization at its heart is moving from a fuel-based economy to a metals-based economy. And one of the key geopolitical questions is access to those metals, such as lithium and other critical raw materials. And then there's the question of financing a global transition. How are poorer countries going to move with the developed world in their own transition? Because we are in a geopolitical situation which is quite unprecedented in Western history. Firstly, China is ahead in terms of the productivist side of the transition. And secondly, in a kind of crucial way, the West is not fully in control of its own destiny anymore, because even if it completed all of the transition at home, as long as the rest of the world doesn't go along with it, that doesn't solve the global warming problem. We need to all decarbonize together in order to get to that safe path forward south of 2 degrees of warming. So that's what we've tried to sketch out in terms of what is the green world order. And then our kind of point that Shaheen kind of summarized so eloquently there is really geopolitics begins at home. That if Europe wants to be an effective actor on the world stage, it needs to grapple internally with all of these dilemmas and traps. Really, the most essential one is financing, that Europe needs to overcome these huge self-imposed hurdles in terms of unlocking the cash in order to propel us into tomorrow. And our final observation is that the transition, which could have been a source of global cooperation, is increasingly defined by global competition between the United States and China, and Europe needs to develop its own geopolitics moving forward on this, engaging and working closely with the United States on critical minerals, but also working where necessary with China and trying to foster cooperation on climate more broadly, and trying to limit the extent to which this becomes a competitive zero-sum game. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was a very thorough overview of a very thorough report. So I think we have a lot to dig in. We have a bunch of audience questions. Maybe this will go back to Ben. Maybe Tim, this might be a good one for you too. I kind of want to put a few questions together that focus a little bit on China. Ben, you mentioned the need for the US, for Europe, for China as well, to sort of work towards not making this a geopolitical zero-sum game. But it sort of feels like we're already there. It seems like that's the approach that is being taken, and that's the approach that the US and the EU have sort of adopted. So is it too late to turn it around? And then further, we have a major election in the United States this November. One of the candidates potentially will be Donald Trump. That's what it's looking increasingly like. And US industrial policy is a major focus of his, but climate change isn't. That's just kind of not where the Republican Party is today. And so is there a world in which the EU and China cooperate more with each other on these issues? So Tim, maybe you can start on that, and then Shaheen and Ben, if you want to jump in just on the broader question of China, I think that would be great. So Tim, over to you.
Yeah, just sort of narrowly speaking, the sort of the liberal trading order has been sort of weaponized by many actors, and China sort of grew its massive green industrial dominance behind sort of protective tariffs and subsidies that were preferential towards Chinese firms. So the one of the points that we make in the report is, there's been the death of that liberal WTO order over the last 20 years, and we really are in a new position where we have to come up with a new negotiated agreement. And that's going to be competitive, it's going to be weaponized, weaknesses are going to be exploited. China in particular has been sort of retaliating against the chips export controls imposed by the United States in October 2022 by using its dominance in rare earths and in metals and doing sort of counter export controls. So this is no longer sort of a siloed, you people in the energy world can sort of figure that out and come up with a deal, and you people in the geopolitical foreign policy world can figure out what to do about a containment club between the US and Europe against China. So this is now, and all of these silos have been sort of broken down. Climate cannot be left in a silo where we can sort of cooperate on climate and compete on foreign policy. And that's, largely what we try and do in this report, to provide a sort of a unified approach to climate and actually track where Europe has, some of its own levers of power to employ. And we certainly don't say that, Europe should cooperate with China on an unconditional basis. It should cooperate to achieve its own objectives of planetary climate stability, and it should also cooperate only if its industries can continue to receive sort of even-handed protection in the mineral supply chains. I'll pass it on to Shaheen.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this. I think the real Rachel really highlighted the real trouble is to try and recreate space for a cooperative order in a system that is increasingly competitive and confrontational. And this is where Europe has maybe a special role to play, given the dynamics between the US and China being, I think, now wholly confrontational. Maybe the one actor that can try to revive a bit of cooperative instincts is Europe. The issue is that Europe's reflexes when it comes to that are rooted in the international order, in the international institutions that Tim has described. And the problem is that the legitimacy of these institutions has decayed over the years and is declining as we speak, making the space for these cooperative action increasingly limited and difficult. And I think this is the real issue. How do you recreate cooperation in a world where the institutions that were designed to create that cooperation have been weakened, delegitimized, are perceived in many parts of the global South as non-representative and largely designed to further the interest of Europe and the US. And I think that's a fundamental sort of historical challenge to which we haven't found a solution, but that requires a lot of attention.
Ben, did you want to add anything?
I think it's very important when looking at China from Europe to recognize the kind of enormous centrality that China has in the 21st century, and that an approach to China will need to have many elements. I think it's important that an approach to China works along, what some politicians have called the three C's, that there is a combination of cooperation, competition, and challenge. And I think that what we've tried to do in this report is show what those three C's would kind of look like in decarbonization. There's going to be a need to compete with China in terms of industrial policy, which is why the European Union needs to unlock that financing in order to strengthen its own green capacities and green industries. There's going to be a need to cooperate with China in, firstly, the global context of COP, but also in all kinds of other ways as those become available. But in terms of challenge, we've been very clear in this report that Europe shouldn't be giving away anything for nothing, and that Europe should really seek to kind of negotiate with its partners in order and be willing to kind of trade things in exchange for real cooperation and real progress on climate change. The obvious coda is that if that doesn't happen, then that shouldn't happen.
Thanks. I might follow up with you, Ben. There's a question from Laurel Atkinson, who's tuning into the event, and she sort of touches on a few things that you've already spoken about a little bit, but I think we can go into a little bit more detail. She says, because climate change is a global problem that affects every state's security, isn't accord necessary? So isn't cooperation necessary between geopolitical bodies and different multilateral organizations to streamline regulation on industrial practices and energy innovation for comprehensive global decarbonization? So, for example, wouldn't interaction between two major bodies like the BRICS and the EU sort of transcend the divide between autocracies and democracies? And do you think that is possible?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and I think that's the kind of, that's a subject for further research. That's not something we've touched on. Something we've touched on here, really. But I wanted to kind of make a few points about optimism. Firstly, one of the points that actually Mark Carney, former central banker in the UK and in Canada, and some people think a future Canadian politician, keeps referencing in terms of why he's optimistic, is the sheer scale of financing that is now going into clean energy projects. That really we've seen such a dramatic uptick in this over the last 5 years. The transition has clearly begun, and that is in itself a source of optimism. Second point is, where are we in terms of the degrees above pre-industrial levels that we're likely to be at by mid-century? The progress that's already been made has pulled us back from the most apocalyptic 3 degrees projections, and it looks like that we should be able, on current trends, really that investment flooding in, to bring that down quite over the next few years below 2 degrees. Obviously, a lot of hurdles, but that's again a source of optimism. And then the whole COP process continues to go on despite geopolitical competition, and progress has been made there. Really, despite the kind of intense kind of enmities of the international system, the fact that this is still going on and making some progress is in itself a source of optimism. And now for Europe, why should one be optimistic about Europe? It's very easy to look at Europe's predicament, and as Shaheen put it kind of so eloquently, it's not a real Europe is not a real federation, and Europe has state-like qualities, but is not a state. Really, despite this, we've seen Europe over the past few years as the European Union take dramatic action when it comes to collective debt in order to establish the Corona Fund to bail out economies and businesses during the pandemic and avoid a catastrophic depression. That's really bold action there. And we've really seen Europe in 2022 take bold action to decouple from Russian energy really substantially. That's been done through a combination of industrial policy and diplomacy, and the results are striking. So Europe has the capacity to act. So I think that all of those factors there mean that there are reasons to be optimistic about what the EU can achieve in the world.
Thanks. There's another question from the audience that says, European far-right parties are expected to make big gains in June's election. How would that impact the EU's green energy policy going forward? Maybe Shaheen and Tim might want to touch on that. Also, how would a second von der Leyen term impact Europe's decarbonization? Those are two questions that are separate, but I think we can put them into one.
Yeah, I'll bundle them. So it's true that it's concerning that the far right in Europe has become united essentially against green and energy transition. And I think the surge of the far right, allied in some cases with the mainstream right-wing parties, can become a real obstacle to further Europe's decarbonization objectives. I would say my sense is that even with the surge of the far right that we can forecast for the next European elections, they are unlikely to be able to wield a majority. And I think what will happen as a result of that is that the governing coalition inside the European Parliament, which today is made of the EPP, the Liberals, and the Socialists, will have to be extended to a grand coalition that includes not only the Liberals, the EPP, and the Socialists, but also the Greens. And so by virtue of forcing a grand coalition of the mainstream parties, and by virtue of forcing the Greens inside this governing coalition, I think it actually has greater chances of solidifying the sort of climate transition and Green Deal policies of the EU. And I think that also will enable von der Leyen to have a second term, and a second term with the sort of coalition that, ironically, she tried to build in 2019 and failed to achieve in 2019. If you remember, in 2019, when von der Leyen was appointed, she sought to convince the Greens to back her, and that's why she actually supported the Green Deal. And the Greens hesitated and ended up not supporting her and sat in the opposition. I think this time around, the Greens are probably going to be compelled to support her simply because without the Greens, it will be difficult to command a majority. And I think as a result of that, they are likely to salvage what I think could be seriously undermined by the rise of the far right otherwise. So, I'm not welcoming this rise of the far right. I think in many cases, including at the national level, it will be a source of concern. But at the European level, I think it could actually force the Greens into the majority and actually strengthen von der Leyen's resolve to essentially further what she has achieved in her first term, which was to set the Green Deal in motion and to further it into the second term.
Yeah, the only thing I'd sort of add to that is that, there is European populists that have sort of built this arc of reluctance, and they're opposed to not just climate, but immigration, but they're now transforming into sort of full-blown climate skeptics. And, there's a lot of reason for optimism in the way that sort of Shaheen laid out. But, I think it's also posing an actual serious political problem, which is that Europe's climate policy paradigm has been very technocratic and engineered without much accounting for social concerns. And, the task ahead does require deep and sort of sustained engagement with the public, and a rethinking about jobs and justice, and social transfers that are necessary to the most vulnerable households. All of those is sort of a productive tension in whether or not the EU sort of reforms its fiscal rules, whether that's kind of spending is actually going to be increased to support investment in jobs and affordable sort of green goods. And this is where European elites have sort of come up short, and we've sort of mapped out, all of the challenges that they'd have to fix.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I think I might want to ask one final question and then sort of do a round of closing thoughts from each of the panelists. Tim, in your opening remarks, you were talking about the EU and its allies looking to establish this critical raw materials club, partly to counter China's existing dominance in its access to critical raw materials, and Russia hasn't really expressed much interest in decarbonization or critical materials, it seems. But is it worth considering that Russia might attempt to pivot toward China in this domain? And is this something that Europe has to contend with and worry about? So I might go back to you to sort of maybe talk a little bit more about the Russia-China aspect of this, and then go to Tim and Ben for closing thoughts. And then anything else that you feel burning that you want to get out, please go ahead and add that to your comments as well, Tim. So back to you.
Yeah, just on the question of the Critical Raw Minerals Club, it's to sort of guarantee adequate supply that is reliable, that is cheap. And you know, both of these two things can be at odds with one another. Europe has, you know, the famous sort of Brussels effect of a regulatory superpower. So if it did want to create sort of a new contracts and cartels to organize prices so that they do remain stable and you don't have massive spikes and gluts, you know, that is something that it can do, given that it would, you know, in any conceivable scenario, remain a buyer of at least a quarter or a third of global metals. And then secondly, you know, how do you actually engage with countries that have minerals, be it Russia, be it China, be it Nigeria, Brazil, etc., is a very serious trade-off between jobs at home or jobs abroad, between value added at home and value added abroad. And that is a difficult trade-off to achieve. And it would require, if Europe wants to sort of guarantee adequate supply, it's going to have to negotiate with some of these mineral powers where European companies are willing to set up shop and do value-added processing abroad and not just at home. And you know, these are policy trade-offs that you know, Europe has already been dealing with and will continue to deal with.
Shaheen, I might come to you and then to Ben for some closing thoughts.
No, I think, you know, what I would stress here is, I think Europe's double responsibility. It's internal responsibility and the challenges it faces, but also the role that it can play globally, both as a bridge between the US and China in a potentially growing conflict, but also between sort of the North and the South, with, you know, existing institutions and international financial institutions and need for serious reform in order to be able to finance the transition in the South. And these, I think, are the two important challenges that Europe needs to face.
Thank you. Ben?
And just some closing thoughts from me, you know, really just talk about optimism again. We have an astonishing amount of money that's been unlocked over the last few years that's beginning to go into clean energy. It's nowhere near enough, but those numbers are really impressive. We have seen over the last few years a political process towards decarbonisation, both globally and also taking place in parallel in the three major hubs of the world economy. And that's not nothing. That's something to be to give us hope. We've seen Europe able to act on faced with dramatic problems from Corona or Russia's energy war on the EU economy. So we've seen evidence that Europe, as the EU, can take action and move forward at speed when it so chooses and when the politics aligns. And a kind of closing thought on terms of the great power politics between China, the European Union, and the United States. It's worth saying that, you know, the current small thaw between the United States and China is something to be encouraged, following along from the Xi-Biden visit, and also the largest Chinese delegation in sort of recent memory coming to Davos, of course, in Europe, is a sign of potentially a sort of a new moment in the sort of global dynamics here, where Europe can play a positive role, sort of fostering and encouraging that inner spirit, which combines challenging where necessary, competing where necessary, and cooperating where necessary as well. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you so much, Shaheen. Thank you, Tim. This has been a fascinating discussion, and the report is fascinating as well. So for everyone who hasn't yet read it, Escaping the Permanent Suez, Navigating the Geopolitics of European Decarbonization. It's on the Atlantic Council's website. It's on our social media accounts. So please go ahead and check it out, dig in. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to gather from it. So again, thank you so much for this conversation, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.